All right, we're up. This is the Hour Town with Troy By, and I feel it is a distinct pleasure for me to welcome Cathy Reisenwitz today to the show. How are you?
I'm well. The pleasure is all mine.
I feel like I've said this before. Where do you start with the guest, or what does Cathy represent? Some people it's real clean, right? They come in and I'm retired FBI and now I'm working Crime Stoppers. Great. Other people, I don't know, they did whatever in the military and now they're doing this. Well, Cathy's a writer, number one. She has a blog, Sex and the State. We're going to talk principally about housing today. I say principally, we'll see. And that's kind of a passion project for her as a native of Alabama. And I'm just kind of doing just a little bit of a gloss over, right? And I think we'll dive into each of the elements as we go forward. But it's kind of cool to see the number of, you're definitely a media person, right? You're a writer, and it's all about, you're a marketer, and politics are important to you. Your position, your platform, if you will, and you're not shy, to share what you feel, and it's represented in your work. Your resume is awesome.
Well, thank you.
Your resume is kind of like, I was telling someone the other day, I hate resumes that are just kind of full of expected fluff. What's your objective? My objective is to work for an employer that will, benefit from my, get out of here. No one cares. You kind of just stick to, this is what I've done. You can read my stuff. You can see my interviews. That's who I am. You agree with that assessment?
I hope so. I hope that's accurate.
Yeah, I think it is. And so, again, I don't know how to even begin to fit you into a category of explaining who Cathy is.
Yeah, it's tough.
Have you been asked that recently at all?
I feel like I get asked that kind of thing, like introduce yourself, right? And
Yeah.
It's like, I'm a writer, I'm an advocate, I'm an activist, I'm a nerd. I have a lot of opinions, and I do a lot of research, and I try to make the world better through better policy and cultural change, and hopefully writing that helps people feel less alone.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know really how you, and you care.
I care.
I think you care.
Yeah. Too much, probably, but yeah, for sure.
I did we were supposed to do this about 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
Work things always get in the way, but I'm kind of glad I had the extra time, because I try my best I never want to be that podcast that just kind of does the standard, I'm going to have this person on. In my opinion, I think a lot of times it's more about they're going to put as little effort as possible into the interview. I'm going to ask these standard 10 to 15, 20 questions, and we'll see where the conversation goes, right? But I hope that it comes, like, I really care. Like, I just did a episode on the former AIDS Action Coalition, now called Thrive Alabama. I got into that just as far as the research. And at some point, I realized I was going way too far down the rabbit hole of trying to understand more about AIDS, because we probably weren't going to get to that in the episode and call attention to Thrive. And that's why Mimar was there. But it was just something I never really researched. I just kind of grew up in that, and I was too young to maybe really care. Not that I didn't care. I don't know. I was just too young. And now even homelessness, as you sit here, right? And you have and shout out to Rob Clark, who's in the studio with us, who helps Cathy with the homeless, Huntsvillians for homelessness.
Housing for Huntsvillians.
Oh, why did I say that?
That's the antidote to homelessness, housing.
That's been on my mind, too much homelessness, as I've been doing research.
Same.
But I've been not just listening to I've listened to a lot of your episodes, probably with start to I'm up to 9 now.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And that's just kind of the research that I try to do. And then I dove off from there to say, okay, what else has Cathy been a guest? Oh, it's overwhelming. There's a lot. Where do we start? And of course, you have been on a lot of other shows to talk about various things, loneliness and feminism and masculinity and different topics.
Yeah. I will say, when I was when I was listening to your podcast, I was really impressed by the level of research that you do on each of your guests, and you have a lot of guests, so that's a lot of research. So it's very impressive.
Which ones have you listened to? I know you did. Shout out to Keith Overholt. from Downtown Rescue Mission. You guys interviewed him as well.
We did. And I listened to your interview with John Gavach.
Oh, yeah.
And I listened to your interview with, I forget her name, but she does development for Wellstone.
Karen Peterson.
And bits and pieces of various other interviews, but those are the ones that I really went deep on.
That light that hangs above you, I think about that light. When I hear John, he was the last guest to not benefit from that light.
Oh.
I was using these as key lights, and it was...
Sorry, John.
Yeah. But that was fun.
Yeah.
I thought that was a good episode.
He's a really interesting person.
Have you met him?
We met him, and he spoke at, I also run Huntsville New Liberals.
Mm-hmm.
We have a happy hour every month, and I think it was last month that he spoke at our happy hour.
About the Singing River Trail?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Don't you, when you look at him, you feel like, yep. And he'll say it. He is like he should have been the only applicant. He was like the only choice they even considered for this job.
Yeah, he's amazing. He's one of a kind.
As a former park ranger and
professor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we should start with what's most topical as it relates to housing for Huntsvillians. And that was, I think, the episode you guys just released last night. Because is it tomorrow night that there's a meeting?
There's
a city council meeting?
There was a meeting tonight, and there are 2 meetings tomorrow.
So again, and sometimes when you do too much research, you're kind of like, all right, well, where do we start? Well, let's just start with that. And then I think we'll be able to unpack a lot of things. But in essence, if you would like to just give a overview of what you and Rob discussed on the Millcreek the mixed-use development project and related to radon, and we'll go from there.
Okay, I love it. I spoke for 20 minutes last night, so I'll try to condense it, but I've learned more today, so you might have to interrupt me. But essentially, Huntsville in the 1950s erected I don't know how many buildings there were, but Butler Terrace and Johnson Towers are public housing developments, sets of buildings that were operated by the Huntsville Housing Authority. And sometime in the 20 teens, it came to light that a lot of public housing in the U.S. had unsafe levels of radon. Radon is a colorless, odorless gas that is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the U.S. And so AL.com and Oregon Live and maybe some other reporters got together and wanted to find out if Huntsville's, and they looked at other parts of the country as well, our public housing had a radon problem, and whether the city was monitoring the radon issue and taking any efforts to mitigate it. And they found that there was a radon problem, that the levels of radon were above the level that the federal government had designated as safe in half of the units that they looked at, and that the city was not testing the units according to U.S. law, and that so then AL.com informed the Huntsville Housing Authority officials there are unsafe levels of radon in these units. At some point, the Huntsville Housing Authority performed their own testing, and then in 2019 or 2020, I think it was 2020, I think it was 2018, the testing was done, and 2018, the officials were told. 2020, the people who lived in the public housing in Huntsville found out about the levels of radon because the AL.com reporters came through and asked them about it. So for at least a year, the Huntsville Housing Authority officials knew about the unsafe levels of radon and did not tell the residents about it, or, as far as we can tell, take any real measures to mitigate it.
Is there anything you've come across yet where they're like, okay, it was over a number, but not up to this other number, and it's in that range? It's probably not safe, but not at a number that gets into critical, if that makes sense. Have you come across anything like that yet?
All of the information I've seen indicates that at least some of the units were absolutely in the unsafe range.
Okay.
They were not borderline.
Okay.
I mean, and partly due to the radon issues, the city has demolished some of the housing and plans to demolish all of it. So that's possibly an indication that it was not safe.
Well, and then just to add, on the federal level, right? I think it was 1988 when HUD was told you need to mandate this, and it wasn't until 2013 that they actually like said, okay, yeah, now we're going to take this seriously and make properties insure. So there was kind of this 25-year where HUD was kind of dragging their feet, from what I understand.
Not only did HUD drag their feet, but that 2013 decision didn't turn into action. There was absolutely no funding or enforcement for the individual housing agencies across the nation. So HUD has just basically said, oh, well, and the individual housing authorities have said, oh, well. And then when Huntsville was forced to do something because public outcry, they asked HUD for money to move people and mitigate. And apparently, according to them, HUD said, no, we don't have, radon is not an emergency. You're on your own for this. So, interestingly, in 2013, Huntsville City Schools were under a consent order from the Department of Justice to desegregate their schools. The Department of Justice had found that the schools were too segregated by race. And so they redrew their district lines, who goes to which school.
This was only 10 years ago?
Yes, okay. 10 years ago. And this redistricting, this redrawing of the zoning caused the projects to be zoned for, I want to say, Jones Valley and Blossomwood and other majority white schools that served pretty high income families in Huntsville. And then a couple years later, we find the radon. A couple years after that, they're slated for demolition, these projects in this land zoned for these schools. And we're going to replace these projects with mixed income, mixed use development.
That's the $400 million project?
That's yes. I don't know where the reporter who and you can find the sources in the show notes on our podcast, but I forget which reporter, but that was from some reporter. But what I found in the plan from the city was it's going to cost the city $8 million a year to operate the public housing portion of the new development.
That stuff you came across today?
Today and yesterday, yes.
Okay. It's kind of day for day. I should mention that your goal, you and Rob's goal, is to end homelessness by August of 2026.
That's right.
Right? Where did if we could let me just key on that. How did that date come to be? So I launched Huntsville New Liberals in June 2023, this June. And I really had been not engaged in Huntsville politics before that. And so I had an open mind about what issues to focus on. I kind of wanted to get people together and say, like, what are the most pressing issues for the people who have been paying attention? And what I heard most often was bicycling, walking, and transit, like the infrastructure to help us get around without cars. And I think that's wonderful. I'm all for that. But as I looked into it and started paying more attention, I focused on housing when I was in San Francisco. I wrote a column about housing policy. I was part of the pro-housing movement. Like, I volunteered. I, volunteered for campaigns and all that. But I was like, I don't know, maybe housing isn't Huntsville's most critical issue. But the more I looked around and the more I paid attention, even when it comes to, like, car alternatives, those are much easier to do when you have dense housing. I joined Huntsville HEC, the Huntsville Environmental Coalition. Well, what benefits the environment? One thing is to get out of car dependency. How do you drive? How do you create a situation where the average person spends less time on transportation? Well, they live closer to where they need to go every day. So everything you'd want, economic growth, environmentalism, racial justice, gender equity, economic mobility, like all of these things are directly impacted by housing. And when I look at like what's
burdening, especially low-income Huntsvillians. It's the cost of rent, the fact that rent is skyrocketing and incomes aren't. So, yeah. So we launched Housing for Huntsvillians in August 2023, a few months after I'd started Huntsville New Liberals. And I just thought, you know what, 3 years is a reasonable time frame.
Yeah.
I think we should be able to, if not solve homelessness, because homelessness is a policy choice, at least have everyone who has the ability to pay a modicum of attention, at least let them know that this is a choice that we're making and that we don't have to make it.
Is that becoming known, your goal? Has that starting to make its way in city councils and just other, even if it's like political action committees, that, hey, there's this thing, and Cathy's, back.
I'm back.
And you're back. She's back, and she's got an aggressive plan. Is that percolating at all?
I think it's definitely percolating among the people I'm reaching out to. So what I'm doing right now is trying to build coalitions. And the first kind of targets that I've had are people who are already working in homelessness, people who are already activated and working on this issue. So, I reached out to First Stop today. Obviously, we talked to Keith Overholt of the Downtown Rescue Mission. We have volunteered for, I'm forgetting their name, but they are the only shelter that accommodates entire families.
Yeah, it was New Futures.
New Futures.
Yeah.
So yeah, that kind of thing. I reached out to United Way, like just trying to figure out like who's already working on it. The Community of Hope we've talked to, and we're trying to talk to the city. We're showing up to city council meetings, and we're involved in HEC because obviously we have overlapping goals. So just finding the people who are kind of already on the side of housing the homeless and increasing density and affordability. And so yeah, I think it's going pretty well. Obviously, like I would love to be informing more people faster, but we'll get there.
When you contacted First Stop, or in this, I'm sure because it's day to day for you, right? It's almost like me, like with this podcast, and I only came here 2 years ago, and it's like every day I'm learning something new, right? Or I learned something from this discussion that kind of makes me focus on different things going down the road. But are they aware of the Millcreek thing? Were you able to get some sort of sentiment out of any of those in the past 24 hours on how they feel about it? Because essentially, you're going from all public housing now to the crux of the matter that you guys talked about in your podcast was, well, it's 10% this and 15% that, and it's going to be 75% market price, that type of thing, which is it's not apples to apples, right? In the way this is coming to be.
Yeah, I mean there were a few cruxes of the episode, but I think one thing that's been really, really gratifying is that I learned about the Millcreek meetings through Tia Turner, who is the co-lead of Love Huntsville. Mm-hmm. So, I believe they're at the tonight's meeting, and then we'll be at the evening meeting tomorrow. And so, two different people, someone from HEC and then someone from New Futures who volunteers at New Futures, sent me an article about how Huntsville is hiring like an affordable housing person. And so having these connections where people can, help me, keep up with what's relevant and going on has been really, really encouraging.
Mm-hmm. And then, so is it a public input meeting?
Yes. The three are public. Well, one of them might be for residents, but I think the public is allowed to go to all of them.
So do you get up for 5 or 10 minutes, or how does that work?
I have no idea how these work. I don't know.
If you do get 5 or 10 minutes, what are you going to say?
I have many questions. Yeah.
You don't know what those ones are yet?
Oh, I don't know. And this is what's so hard is like, what is the highest ROI question I can ask? Because I probably am not going to have time to ask every question I could possibly think of. And so one thing that's going through my head right now is, this is kind of nerdy, shockaroony, but I relearned what a TIF is today, which is tax increment financing. And I learned today from reading the plan that part of the development is going to, well, the whole development is supposed to be, the whole area is supposed to be designated a TIF district. And so the whole point of a TIF is if there is an area of land that is quote unquote blighted, which means there's no hope for getting private entities to invest in that piece of land, then the government will essentially like front the money to private developers to develop it and then get paid back by the increased property taxes from the, now more valuable land. Well, I don't see any reason why private developers shouldn't want to develop Millcreek if they have legal permission to do so. If it's zoned properly and the building ordinance wouldn't prevent them from building there, why do we as taxpayers need to front this money? Like, why are private developers not taking the risk and reaping the reward, and then this taxpayer is reaping the reward of the higher tax revenues? Like, why?
So the blighted land, it seems undesirable.
Yes, that's the theory.
Kind of like this, like basically, I didn't realize this till I moved. We moved here when you had like 5 seconds to decide. You want this house?
Yeah.
Because if not, it's going to go to someone else.
Yeah.
And apparently, it's a swamp, right? I guess at one point you look around, yeah, it's a swamp. They probably had to spend a lot of money on bringing dirt in, right? I don't know. I would imagine that for anybody who's been here a long time, like they never ever would have thought there to be a house that sits here because it's a swamp. Is it like that where?
No, it's more like
hills and just the terrain.
Blight is usually, frankly, it seems to me like blight is more like
railroad track,
a demographic designation. Like the people who live there are undesirable.
Okay. So then if you build, then you may never attract. You may be able not to sell it, if you will. It'll just go vacant.
Yeah.
Because the larger population won't want to live there.
Right. That's right. That's my understanding. But I think all that's false and racist. But I think that's the idea.
So I know that in your time in San Francisco, you had a personal experience, if you will, where you noticed a gentleman, and that just happened to me I was just in St. Louis. And I don't know if you didn't listen to my first stop interview, I did tell Jessica Brown, like, I got a brother who's homeless and he's a meth addict and all this stuff, right? And so up until like the last 4 or 5 years, I certainly feel differently now about homelessness, right? And that experience. And then I think similar to the gentleman that you described, I was in St. Louis for a day. I would go to see the Cardinals play. On the way in, I passed this guy who's, he's kind of not high yet. And then later, I see him really, he's talking to himself and doing whatever. And then later I see like his head's been bashed in, and one of his buddies is trying to help him and he's got some sort of makeshift gauze. And I just like, it's one of those moments, right? Where you're like, man, it just hit me. And I can't really lose that image of my mind of just the struggle that this poor guy's going through, and who knows what happened in that altercation, why he's got a laceration in his head. But can you just quickly describe that experience that you had in San Francisco, where you kind of just, I guess, was somewhat awakened to being passionate about this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So I moved from DC to San Francisco. In with a boyfriend. He worked at Apple, so we lived in Noe Valley, which is a neighborhood in San Francisco. And Noe Valley is kind of like lesbian Stepford kind of neighborhood. It's very nice. We lived between an artisanal cheese shop and an olive oil shop. And I was writing for the Bay City Beacon, the housing policy column. And so I was walking to the offices from Noe Valley to Soma, I guess is what you would call it, Tenderloin Soma. And it's like you go through the Castro and then within a few blocks, it's just like a different world. And I saw a man bleeding from the head laid out on the sidewalk. He looked like he was homeless. And I was like, this man needs immediate medical attention. So I called 911 and I was going to be late. And I reported it, but I was like, I can't wait around to see if when they respond. And so as I kept walking, I saw more people who looked like they were in need of immediate medical attention. And I quickly realized if I called 911 for every person I saw who needed help immediately, I would never get anywhere in the city. And I was just listening to the Significant Others podcast. Really love it. And it was about Maya Angelou and James Baldwin. And I'm going to horribly mess up the quotes. I'm not even going to try to quote it. But essentially, James Baldwin was saying there's no way to dehumanize others without dehumanizing yourself. And I just felt my humanity being stripped away by the fact that I was forced by circumstance to just tolerate human immiseration. And I knew that if I found myself in a similar situation where I'm bleeding from the head and in need of immediate attention or help of any kind, I could not trust anyone around me to help me because everyone has already become inured to it. Because that's the only way to get anything done in that city. It's the only way to survive is just to ignore it. And It was terrifying.
How long ago was that?
I moved there in 2017.
Got it. By the way, is it too warm in here? It took a while for me to realize we need to turn the air on. Are you okay?
I'm okay.
You want some water? You got some water.
I got water.
Do you want a water, Rob? Okay. All right. Yeah. You're not human, right? If you don't have those kinds of feelings.
Right.
And then that is that reality that it just seems cold, right? When you turn that off.
It is cold. And it's worse than cold. And this is what I think people don't understand. Like, why are you so worked up about this? Because we're heading in the same direction. Mm-hmm. And when you live in a city where homelessness is rampant and people are unsheltered, the people you come in contact with who are homeless are usually the most deranged, psychotic of the home. Most homeless people are not mentally ill. They're not addicted to anything. They just lost their housing. But there is a subset and there's a lot about homelessness that causes and exacerbates addiction and mental illness. So, but the people who are going to accost you on the street who are homeless, that's a small percentage of the homeless population, but they're the ones you see and the ones you think about and the ones you hear and the ones that are in your face. And you start to get angry at them because they're screaming at you and brandishing knives and, making your life scary. Even though, on a systemic level, you understand, these people are victims and they need help. But you're also I just need to get to work without getting screamed at today. Mm-hmm. And it's seeing that empathy and sympathy and concern turn into anger is just also, a horrible thing to have to live through and something I don't want to see happen here.
So you walked by that every day?
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't. I probably didn't realize until I went to Seattle.
Yeah.
This was only maybe 5 years ago. I had always encountered, I'm from the D.C. area, Virginia side, and, there's homeless people. And if I went to a Redskins game or a Nationals game or just being downtown, you encounter it. But that was a different level,
yeah,
right? Where I'm walking to, I was staying at a hotel and I went to the Mariners game. And I figured it was 5 or 6 blocks of walk there. And then you get towards the stadium, you're like, whoa, this is tent city, kind of well, how do I enter? And I'm not really afraid in a way, hey, bring it on. If we're going to fight, we're going to fight. I don't want to get shot or stabbed, but I wasn't necessarily worried for my life, but it was well, what? I just want to appropriately enter the stadium. How do I do that? It took me a little while to figure that out. And then we were just I'd never been to Hawaii, and we went in February for a work trip. The whole west side of Oahu on the beach is just homeless, and it's, so then you start wondering like, well, like they need a place to go and the island's only so big, but should I feel upset as a tourist that I can't go to this 10 miles of beach because that's where they live?
Right.
And that's actually, they have some great thing about Hawaii. There's all kinds of public bathrooms and restrooms and stuff that you don't always see at beaches.
Right.
And like, but that's their territory.
Right.
I guess I could go to the beach, but then I just don't want possible altercation or
Right.
I don't know, or maybe at that time I just didn't feel like going there. I didn't want to like have my heartstrings pulled.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And those are just sometimes. And then I guess when you were talking to Keith, I didn't realize that he was saying that in certain middle class neighborhoods, there's tents just in the neighborhoods. I don't know if you picked up on that.
Oh yeah.
And I have not seen that yet. But now you're like, oh my goodness,
Or
like that is definitely crisis level.
Not tent in San Francisco. People will sleep on your doorstep.
Really?
Oh yeah, that's a common occurrence. Someone just sleeping on your doorstep. They're just taking a little bit of shelter right there, and you have to like step over them to get out your door. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to the Millcreek thing, I guess, or just the episodes that you all have done in the last couple of months, and the progress being made. But can you call attention to some other things that you want to talk about that are going on in the city or not going on in the city? Maybe just stay on the Millcreek thing or something else.
I mean, with the Millcreek thing, I think it's really important to understand that this project will likely result in a net reduction of units of public housing. The plan is not calling for as many units as have been destroyed and will be destroyed. Mm-hmm. So we're going to have a net reduction in units of public housing. 1, 2, there's a 700 family long wait list for public housing in Huntsville right now. 3, we have a 400 person point in time count for homelessness in Huntsville. There's really good evidence that point in time counts vastly underestimate rates of homelessness. So,
say that again, 400?
400, yeah.
At any point in time are homeless.
Yes, but again, that's an underestimate.
Right.
Likely.
It's probably more like 2,000.
Yeah, depending on how you define homelessness. But if you define it in the most broad terms, yeah, at least probably 2,500. Yeah, who knows? We can't know because we're not taking accurate counts. But it's major and it's growing every day. And there is no city in the U.S. that has solved or even reduced rates of homelessness through public housing. There's no city in the U.S. that has built enough public housing to reduce its rates of homelessness. The problem is housing is too expensive. Public housing is even more expensive than market rate housing to build. We do not have the political will to spend the amount of money that would be required to build enough public housing to make a dent in homelessness, which means, and even if we could, it would be a very stupid way to do things. Mm-hmm. Why would we? Housing right now is artificially expensive because of policy. Why would we build more artificially expensive housing? Why would we not first reduce the cost of building housing, remove the policies that make housing artificially expensive? Then we would see more housing get built. It would be built cheaper. It would be rented out cheaper. It would be sold cheaper. And then instead of making the government be landlords, which they've demonstrated through the radon issue they're not good at, give needy families who, even with cheaper housing, still can't afford it without assistance, give those families cash instead of vouchers or instead of trying to be landlords, and let them find housing wherever it suits their needs. If they want to be near jobs, if they want to be near other families, if they want to be near services, they should be integrated into the community, not concentrated into poverty. And they should have the flexibility to choose where they live. Give them cash assistance. There's a ton of great research that's recently come out to the point that HUD, Housing and Urban Development, is piloting a program of doing just that, giving families cash instead of trying to be landlords.
What are the minimum qualifications to qualify for public housing?
I think it's just income, but I may be wrong.
Okay. And real quick, let me say this. Let me toot your horn a little bit. So you have an amazing vocabulary, good lexicon here, Rob. I don't know if you've noticed that yet. And one thing I know that you shared that you like about the best feedback you get from your readers is whether they agree with you or not politically, it's just, hey, she challenges me to look at issues, and I guess as long as, people are at least like, oh, wow, I learned something and it opened my eyes to this or that. And I have to admit, I appreciate when I thought of like the policies, right? I don't know what I thought, but then I'm listening and some of the stuff and some of the research I did, and like, I never really thought about heights of buildings requirements. I know in DC it can't, and nothing can be taller than the Washington Monument. That's probably a problem. You go out to Reston and Tyson's, like, can't we go up like 70 floors? I mean, in the wake of 9/11, it's like a little bit scary. I wouldn't want to work up there, but I mean, that and or just density, right? I housed my mother for 7.5 years. She had a traumatic brain injury for most of her life, and we tried to build a house somewhere, and we thought we'd build a mother-in-law suite, and the covenants, and I didn't really think about it, but the covenants of that county, that city, was this in Winchester, Virginia, wouldn't allow it, or if they did, it was kind of like just that my aunt, who's kind of like a real estate agent and different things, she's like, just don't even go there, because there's something's going to happen when it gets to the permitting of the water and the sewer, and it's going to be like a rat's nest you just wish that you hadn't invited. But I hadn't really thought about it. I didn't know that about Huntsville, that you can't build a mother-in-law suite, or if you can, maybe there's some specificity there. But of those, I've mentioned a few. Are there others that I haven't mentioned, or do you want to expand it at all on those policies?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of ways that Huntsville and other cities make density illegal. So yeah, you mentioned ADUs, mother-in-law units. And I'm unfortunately not like, I haven't memorized Huntsville's zoning ordinance, but things like the setback requirements. So how far the dwelling unit has to sit back from the street. So it mandates large lawns, how closely you can locate units next to each other. Obviously prevents density, height requirements, floor area ratios. So how much of the parcel is covered by the unit versus, not unit, lawn, essentially. Parking requirements. One of the things that's really interesting is like building code requirements. So in the turn of the century, a lot of growing cities would have single room occupancy. So these are basically like long-term hotels. So it'd be like a floor, and the whole floor would share a kitchen, and maybe like 3 units would share a bathroom. So it's a very inexpensive way to provide housing to a lot of people. Sometimes people would come into San Francisco, for example, work 8 months, work a month, stay here, then go back. Sometimes this is what people could afford, and so it was a long-term solution for them. Building codes have and zoning ordinances have essentially made this kind of housing illegal. So the kinds of housing, modular housing, for example, SROs, this kind of housing that's kind of naturally affordable, just cheaper on a per unit basis to build, is illegal in many cities, including Huntsville. So Community of Hope, for example, they are looking to build a community similar to what's in Austin, and it's kind of cheaper to build, more naturally affordable housing. It's illegal to build that on any parcel that would be large enough to contain it in the city of Huntsville. So they're having to look at the county. Well, they're positing this as a solution to homelessness. But if you're already low income and then you're having to own and operate a car to get to any employer, that's obviously not going to help you get reintegrated into society. So
has it ever been legal at all in Huntsville, or is it just something that's just never been?
Yeah, I've been listening to the Lily Flagg podcast, and I really like it. And Sue Ann Griffith talks about how I think it was like 1890s, 1850s, Huntsville had a ton of row houses and streetcars. So yeah, like before really the 1950s, our zoning ordinance wasn't implemented until 1963, I believe. Before that, we had, people-centric dense, walkable communities. And then we started building our own cars.
I wonder if, like a lot of things, right, was there unfortunately some sort of violence that went on? And, it's usually, it works until something bad happens and then we're not doing that again, right? And they're like, I don't know, like, we shouldn't co-locate these people. I'm just trying to like understand why you wouldn't do that, or what would be so, vehement opposition to it.
Well, a few things happened. Really, one of the things that prompted cities across the nation to adopt zoning ordinances was racial integration. So it was for a time legal, and it was the law of many lands to create and enforce racially restrictive covenants. So you would buy a house, but you were legally restricted from selling that house to someone of a different race. And so that's how communities kept themselves racially segregated. Then that was ruled unconstitutional. And so cities adopted zoning ordinances. And so instead of saying you can't sell your house to a black family, it said you can't build a house that would be affordable to this kind of person. And hence the density restrictions. And another thing that I think is interesting is that Huntsville adopted its zoning ordinance right around the same time as the United States implemented the Civil Rights Act. So, no, there's really very little evidence that zoning ordinances were at all necessary for any of their intent, like stated purpose. Like, there's no evidence that there was a problem of, for example, noxious industry locating itself in residential neighborhoods, because if you cause problems to those residents can sue. And so, like, why would you do that? The factory owners already had an incentive to like be away from where they're going to get sued for causing problems. So I think, when you look at like Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, and you look at the history of redlining as outlined in Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations, you see that in many cases, zoning ordinances there's pretty good evidence that zoning ordinances were aimed at enforcing legally racial segregation. And there's absolutely, you can't say absolutely no, but there's very little ambiguity on the question of whether zoning ordinances, if not in intent, at least in effect, have legally codified and enforced racial residential segregation.
I want to touch a little bit on the proximity to work. I was talking to a guy at work today, and he was asking me about, I was just up in D.C., right, in Virginia, at our headquarters, and I grew up there. Spent a lot of time there, and I just kept moving further west because it was too expensive, right? And I'm actually probably the perfect embodiment of things that you've talked about, where I just kept moving further and further away because I couldn't afford it, longer commute, and all those impacts. But I was telling him, like, even with the DC train system, you pick a job, it would still be like a hike, I think. I know you did live in the district?
I did.
You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, there's going to be things that just aren't close to the metro line.
Oh, yeah.
And then I said on Northern Virginia side, I was at CIA, and I mean, there's no train that goes there either at any of the locations. And so you're kind of like, yeah, you're going to have a car. And I didn't really think about it. It's kind of like I thought about getting a job first. And then a lot of times you have no choice on the location because they're like, oh, contract's here. Oh, it's moving. You got, we're always kind of moving around. And then, I guess every now and then it might work out. Oh, I actually work somewhere near the train. Cool. And then your situation changes. Are there people that when you mention that still say, yeah, but not all the jobs in Huntsville are going to be accessible via foot, they're not all downtown, because I guess you have to choose your employment then carefully, right? That you are targeting something down in the downtown area. True? Or like,
yeah, I mean,
I would struggle with that to some degree. I guess you would pick your housing after you picked your job. with the intent, hey, I'm either going to walk or, quick bike ride or whatever it might be.
Yeah. I think it would be nice if everything were more central.
Yeah.
Right? Like there are some things that require more land. And so in that case, if most people live in, let's say, downtown and they all need to go to like a factory outside of town, well, then it's easy to run a bus,
Right.
just like San Francisco does to Mountain View and to Cupertino to Apple. You just run a bus. It's fine. But as far as like most jobs, especially the jobs that are growing, they don't require a lot of physical space. Like most, especially good jobs are, they just require like space for humans. And so there's really no reason why we can't co-locate most people and most jobs in a pretty small geographic area, except zoning and policy choices. And I would say if it does happen that you need to move because you get a new job and that job is located far away, that's kind of one of the problems of us having such a strong home ownership society is then that move, if you move residences, is a, $10, $20, $30,000 proposition between taxes and real estate fees and yada, yada. And why are we such a homeownership society? It's not because it's like easier or better. It's because in the US, we have created a situation in which homeownership is for the average middle class person, like their biggest source of wealth building and savings. But a home isn't supposed to be a wealth creation or savings vehicle. It's supposed to be a place to live. And housing cannot be both a huge source of wealth creation for individual owners and broadly affordable at the same time. So I think it's really important that we as a society like break this tie between where we live and how we save and invest for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think of using that example, right? The difference between being a government worker, and I've seen this happen, and they live in like Chantilly, and they say, oh, hey, by the way, you're going to be taking a joint duty assignment, and now you have to go to Fort Meade. What? It's like an hour and a half, but you have to do it. But so, they kind of have no choice because they're trying to hit their pension, their whatever. As a contractor, I'd say, all right, well, I quit. I'll get a new job because I'm not driving an hour and a half. Or, yeah, if you own a home, then you have to, there's a lot to kind of undo that. And those things do happen, which is, I don't know. I don't even know how I survived there to a certain degree because it would just change all the time. I'll tell you about real quick. There was a contract we were on where the government wouldn't even disclose the location of the job until so somehow magically you're supposed to recruit someone in an already very huge metropolitan area. You could somewhat guarantee them. I think it's going to be one of these locations, all of which would have impact and implication on that person trying to commute and figure out. And then it was like, look, if you don't take it, they'll give it to someone else. But like, do you want the job?
Right.
I think so. And there was plenty of times where the government would yield their heavy hand, and you thought it was going to be here, it ends up being there, and the person like almost just says, "Hey, I'll take the job, but I'll quit as soon as I find something better."
Yeah.
Like, what are we doing here?
There's so much about housing policy where you're like, what are we doing here? Right? Like this whole idea of like, oh, well, I want to make myself rich instead of a landlord rich. Well, it's like, well, the best way to disempower a landlord? Build tons of new housing so that they have to compete with each other for tenants, because right now tenants are competing for landlords, which empowers landlords. There should be nothing. I don't mind paying a farmer and a grocer for my food. I shouldn't mind paying a landlord to maintain the place that I live. I resent giving them 50% of my paycheck just because they happen to buy land at a certain point in time. But those are policy choices we've made as a society that we don't need to make.
It is tough for me though. Like, personally, I like on the house, like I have a buddy that was about to be 25 years with a home builder, and then they fired him at 24 years and a half. Right. So no pension. And then, what do you do? Like, well, luckily he had a house he could at least, eventually sell and, get some money back, if you will, from something that he thought he was going to get. My mother, disabled her whole life. has nothing. Never made every 2 weeks she was down to her last $5. And because she's trying to get by and everything, and we didn't live lavishly or anything, but if that's the only asset she had,
right.
And so now she's luckily living in a retirement home in Georgia, and like sold the home in order to basically now just kind of pay for her things. And so I hear you, but sometimes it's like, oh, well, what assets can I have? You work somewhere where there's a 401k. If not, it's up to you for your own IRA, and just like having some sort of future ability to cash in, if you will, especially in the absence of, unless you're in the government, right? You're not getting a retirement package.
Totally. And I'm not like mad at anyone who's using their homes as savings vehicles. Like that's the system we've set up. Like, don't hate the player, hate the game. Like, absolutely. I would just say, and again, this is not about individuals making choices.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about that at all. I think that's very boring. I'm talking about systems, because I'm weird and I think systems are way more interesting. And we have a system where every person who is benefiting from their property values going up, that wealth is being taken from the people who are having to buy into the system. It's a zero-sum exchange. There's no wealth generated. There's no innovation that happens. No one is net better off. It's just taking from generally wealthier, whiter people, taking from generally poorer, browner people and giving to generally wealthier, whiter people. There's a huge gap in home ownership between white people and non-white people, in part due to policies like redlining, like these racial restrictive covenants that then turned into zoning. And so we are transferring wealth upwards through this system, and it's almost like instead of having that system, we should have a social safety net so that people are going to be okay, even if they didn't happen to luck into buying property that appreciates in value. And then people can afford to treat homes as places to live rather than a way to extract wealth from future generations.
I was listening to a podcast you were a guest on. I think it was like libertarian based, right? And you made this comment, hey, this is last year. Hey, I'm excited to come to Alabama because I want to look at things through the conservative lens.
Totally.
And I know in the same one you had the thing like why is San Francisco so effed up?
Yeah.
That thing. When it comes to homelessness, politics is it the same? No matter if you're in California or Alabama?
No.
How do we differ from? I mean, LA. I guess LA. The stat is, every day, 207 people leave homelessness, but every day they gain 270 new. So there's like this net gain of 7,200 over the course of a year. So they're still digging their hole. But can you speak on that a little bit, just from left and right politics and?
Where do I begin?
The floor is yours.
It's funny because I grew up conservative. I grew up here.
Yeah.
I went to Sparkman High School, grew up in Harvest. Southern Baptist, voted for Bush Jr., and then kind of got into libertarianism, and then lived in DC and San Francisco. So two kind of liberal coastal elite places. At least with DC, you have a decent amount of Southerners there. In San Francisco, it was just a whole different universe. So in the 15 years I was gone from Alabama, I felt like I really lost touch with the right. I wasn't paying attention to my news sources were not really right wing. My friends were certainly not right wing. It was, then obviously Trump happened in that time, and it was just this is not the Republican Party. This is not conservatism that I grew up in. This is changed. This is different. I don't know what it is. And so I was excited to come back. Honestly, coming back to Huntsville, if I had felt like things were as screwed in Huntsville as they are in San Francisco, I don't know that I would be doing this work.
Really?
No. San Francisco is really, really screwed. They have had the problems that they've had for 20, 25, 30 years. Like the policy choices that have led to where they are have been in place for decades.
Mm-hmm.
And in that time, there's this like accumulation of this mass of people and candidates and parties and nonprofits and lobbyists and beneficiaries that's grown up around the problem that benefit in some way or depend in some way on these problems to exist for their existence and their wealth and their well-being. And so you've got to fight all of that to get anything done. And all that's very expensive. And a lot of it is taxpayer funded. And then you have the fact that because this problem has been so severe for so long, anyone who's paying any amount of attention has a very strong feeling about it.
Mm-hmm.
And they are, for the most part, on one side or the other of the issue. And if they're on one side of the issue, they seemingly are not open to any information that would indicate that maybe they need to take a different approach in terms of how to solve the problem. So you've got a group of people who are promoting solutions that, you know, maybe aren't aesthetically perfectly in line with what you would want to see, but have empirical evidence to support them. And a group of people who are very, very much opposed to those potential solutions. And so it's just really, really difficult to get anything accomplished. And yet, you know, there are things happening in San Francisco. There is hope on the horizon. I am, I'm not saying it's not going to get fixed, but it's very difficult. I've come to Huntsville and it seems like there's just a lot more pragmatism here than in San Francisco. I think one of the problems with San Francisco is, and this is true kind of across the board when it comes to politics, but it's true to different levels. And that is the people who matter don't care and the people who care don't matter. But I think it's especially bad in San Francisco because the people who matter are so wealthy. They are so wealthy that they don't need government to function to be okay.
Right.
And so, and if you live in San Francisco and you are intelligent, local politics is probably the lowest ROI thing you could possibly do with your time.
Mm-hmm.
Like these people are literally like inventing the future, not to be like too whatever, but you know, they're working on interesting, important, profitable things. And so why would they show up to a city council meeting?
Is there a much smaller middle class there? Or is it just you have a higher proportionate in the, upper middle?
I mean, there basically isn't.
It's like a Caribbean nation where it's the ultra rich and then just poverty?
I would say there are three kinds of people in San Francisco. And obviously I'm being very hyperbolic and oversimplifying it. But there are basically three kinds of people. There are homeless people or basically homeless people. There are newcomers that have very high incomes. And there are people who are able to afford to live there because they bought land or their parents bought land at the right time.
Long time ago.
Yeah, in the 70s or 80s. Yeah. Those are the three kinds of people in San Francisco. And the first kind of person, the homeless person or near homeless person doesn't matter. They don't have the ability to make any change.
Mm-hmm.
The second kind of person doesn't have the desire to make change because they're busy and they're probably not planning to stay long term in San Francisco. They're there to get Google on their resume and develop skills and, you know, have a really high salary history and make money, but they're not necessarily going to stay long term. And the third kind of person, the person who has land wealth, is disincentivized to solve the problem because it might mean that their property values don't rise as quickly, and it might mean that people who are browner and poorer live in their neighborhoods.
Is there also then a lower proportion of like nonprofits that are trying to provide services to the homeless?
There are a lot of nonprofits.
There are a lot?
Yes.
Okay.
But
those are also probably have profitable motive behind them.
Yeah. So for example, and I could not believe this was real, but when I was in San Francisco, I found out about this thing. I think it was called like a community development organization.
Yeah.
And what they do is they literally shake down housing developers and say, if you don't give us millions of dollars or create this playground or, buy us this treat, we are going to block your ability to get a permit to build the housing. And so they have this whole group that they mobilize to file lawsuits, to hold hearings, to delay the housing and to decrease the number of units that they're allowed to build and all these things to make it more expensive. Essentially, they weaponize the system so it's more expensive to not give them what they want, because those housing developers get less profit when the developments are smaller, and they have to pay the mortgage on the land while they're fighting this bureaucracy. So every month of delay is dollars out of the developer's pocket. So essentially, the community development organization has figured out what's the dollar we can shake them down for that will be less expensive to them than the pain in the ass that we can cause them. And that's their whole business model.
Wow.
And that's part of why housing is so expensive in San Francisco, because every unit you are paying for this frickin' playground or whatever, and these salaries of these people who that's their whole job.
Yeah, that's, I guess luckily so far of all the guests I've had on nonprofits, they love their job, right? Or they seem very passionate. They're there because, in like case of Karen, we talked about her a little bit. She was an alcoholic. And now she's a recovering, she's been sober for 20 years, and that kind of pours into her work, right, to help people. And just talk to Mimar, who's been with Thrive since 1988. Like, oh my gosh, like, hats off to people that labor of love, right? But man, there's far too many. When it's always that fine line too, though. There's nonprofits that have to have overhead.
Sure.
I struggle, though, anytime I give a charitable donation, and I know that 90% is probably going to go to overhead, and what happens to the 10%. But at the same time, arguably not that much is really going to happen if it's just volunteer.
Right.
Right. And so you're like, okay, well, which way do you want to have it? Hopefully they're still doing good things. And
sure.
It sucks to ever even have to sit there and debate that. Like, should I give my money to this one or that one, right? Who's going to do something with it?
Totally.
And then, you can also just tell when someone's really, it's just a resume building thing, right? Or it's a profitable thing, or there's some other ulterior motive than really the cause at hand.
Yeah.
Right.